So this presentation is on the SIOP lesson preparation, SIOP model lesson preparation. So after we received our background, this is then the next step, understanding each component in preparing for a lesson. And then as we continue on through the text, we'll be able to break it down a little bit more. So this first component is the content objectives. And so this is something, if you've already had practice with lesson planning, that we typically start with anyway when we're preparing for a lesson. So we want to make sure that our content objectives are clearly defined. They're displayed somewhere in the classroom, somewhere where students can see, and that's because we want to be reviewing it with our students. And I think that that's a big difference in how the SIOP model approaches objectives. I know in my own experience as a teacher, we're certainly outlining the objectives for ourselves so that we can make sure that all of our tasks are helping our students meet the objectives. But in the SIOP model, it really stresses that we share that with the students for a number of reasons. First of all, they then are understanding or learning that there's some ownership here in their own education and that they have some responsibility to their learning. And so it makes them this very active participant in their education and their learning, which I really, really love. It's not such a passive look on it. The other reason is that it really does provide students with a lens or a perspective to approach the lesson. And I think this goes for language learners, but also regular students. They now know, okay, while we're learning this stuff or while, throughout today's class, these are the topics that I really need to pay special attention to. These are the topics that I need to walk away with and have a better understanding of. And so for that reason, you want to make sure it's student-friendly language. It's in a language that they can understand, that makes sense to them. So that they do then kind of step up to this responsibility and take some ownership. So we want to make sure that all of these objectives are still supporting the content standards that we need to address within our courses and also the learning outcomes that are expected. So whether, there are specific assessments or assignments that need to be completed, that we're still moving towards all of that in this process. And because we're sharing this with students, I think we want to limit it to one or two objectives just to reduce the complexity of the task. It can be very overwhelming for students to see all of these things that we need to do or that I need to be able to do by the end. And so if you just put one or two, it makes it much more manageable for the student as well as I think for us too. We're not trying to focus our attention in too many directions. We're narrowing that. And then because we're starting off our lesson and making students aware of it at the beginning, it's really important to revisit them at the end. So typically teachers will do some sort of quick assessment, like an exit ticket type of assessment at the end of a lesson to see if those objectives were met or if there has been some progression towards mastery. But revisiting them, even just as a discussion with the students, is a great way to kind of bring this full circle and bring it back to their attention. So in the text, they offer this chart to help you break down your objectives, really understand your objectives. So what our job is to do. Today, this is what I'm going to do. We will be doing this. Students will be doing this. And then that hopefully takes you, students will be able to do this objective. And so whether or not you decide to use this, it's a great way of taking like a very large idea and topic and narrowing it down specific for the lesson and specifically for what students are going to be doing. The second feature then, after we have our content objectives, are our language objectives. And this might be new. I mentioned this week 1 of the course, and here we are talking about it. But the language objectives may be something that hasn't been discussed in other classes. And so it's just a way for us to carefully look through our lesson and think, what kind of language skills am I now requiring of my students? So the same as the content objectives, you want to make sure that they're clearly defined. They've been displayed somewhere where the students can view them. They've been reviewed with the students for the same reasons. They take some ownership here in their education. They have that perspective. They know, especially if you're a language learner, there might be some anxiety and what am I going to have to do today? And so that really lowers that affective filter that takes away the anxiety for them. And then they know now, okay, I'm going to have to discuss, I'm going to have to write, and they can already kind of come to terms with it and expect it throughout the lesson. And so same thing for those reasons. You want to make sure it's student friendly language. These objectives are supporting the academic language development. So still supporting the terms, the more academic terms and the more academic skills that we're requiring of students, but also those social language skills. So if they're discussing with a partner or with a small group, we're still developing what happens in those social settings. Same idea, you want to limit it to 1 to 2 per lesson and then revisit it again at the end of the lesson. So to gauge mastery, but it could be part of that exit ticket type of assignment. They are also the objectives, a new perspective on subject area. So how is language used to convey information? And I think that this is the question, especially if you're not familiar or used to looking at language objectives, this is the question that's easiest to ask when you're taking like a broader look at your lesson. How is language being used to convey information here? And then that's how you kind of focus or narrow down your language objectives for the lesson. So what do students need to learn about English to learn, express, practice, and apply new information, demonstrate their knowledge, and perform academic tasks? So to come up with those verbs that we typically use in our objectives, the text has provided this chart that shows this process-oriented to performance-oriented set of terms that we could use. So if you take a look over here, process-oriented, they're exploring, they're listening, they're recognizing, maybe they're discussing in small groups. These are a little bit more passive. And so our goal is to always kind of move them along this continuum here so that it's more performance oriented. And that comes with practice, it comes with comfortability, it comes with a development of skills so that they are defining and then drafting, writing, giving an oral presentation, editing. And so that's the goal, that we're moving them along this continuum. So WIDA also has these can-do descriptors that will hopefully open for me here. And so these are a way for you to, or something, a resource for you rather, where you can kind of take a look and see what students can be doing in their own language development. So if you scroll down, they have them all listed by grade level. And so you can see, depending on the grade level, what students should be doing or can be doing. And then this is also a great tool when you're talking with the ESL teacher or a language development teacher. I know the students, this is one of the can-do descriptors. How can I incorporate this in my own lesson, in my own class? That's a great point, a great way to start the conversation and get support. So that's there for you as well. This is also a link that offers more information on categories and examples for developing language objectives. And so hopefully this opens here. But this is also right in the textbook, and it just has grade levels and subject area. I'm sorry, I blanked for a second. Subject area, and there's just some examples there that you can take a look at that might be beneficial. All right, so here are some sample verbs for also writing content and language objectives. So for content objectives, identifying, solving, investigating, these are probably ones you're much more familiar with. But for the language objectives, and it's important too, there when you start to sit down and take a look at your lesson plans, you'll realize that there are a lot of language use and interaction that happens in our classes on a daily basis. So when you're thinking of, okay, what language objectives do I want to focus on, maybe consider your language learners for sure in choosing that, but also what might be challenging and really help with their development, or what's the most important thing that I'm, if I'm prioritizing all of these different tasks, which ones take more priority. And so that's how you can kind of narrow it down. But these are some of the verbs for the language objectives. And there are tons. If you Google it online, if you're really at a loss for those verbs to use in your objectives, Google it. There are plenty out there. So then the third feature in preparing for your lesson is the content concepts. So we always want to make sure they're appropriate for the age and educational background of students. And that's just reiterates and reinforces how important it is to know our students. But then also we want to make sure we want to be aware that it would be inappropriate to use curriculum materials and books from earlier grades. So sometimes in schools, teachers think, oh, well, they're a language learner and they're not quite here yet. I'm just going to grab a textbook from whatever, a younger grade, 2 grades below them, and they can just use that. That's still inappropriate, right? They're still not then technically part of the class. We've just given them a separate thing to do. And so we want to make sure that even though they still have the same materials in front of them, that we're using scaffolding and we're using other strategies so that they can walk away with an understanding. That's the whole point of this model. So providing scaffolding, I mentioned that. And then also sometimes offering a mini lesson provides like a jump start. So you can review some of those key background concepts, introduce vocabulary, and this kind of echoes what we discussed last week. You could lead a picture or text walk, engage students in simulations or role play, use some of those hands-on experiential activities. But all of that then can jumpstart some of this information, and then you can use that jumpstart mini lesson to then refer back to as you progress into the main focus of your lesson, refer back to that, and then that helps build this understanding and this awareness of the content. The fourth feature here is supplementary material. So this allows English learners to understand and complete more cognitively demanding tasks. So this is where we can include real life content. We can enable students to bridge prior experiences with new learning, culturally responsive to student backgrounds. So if you're thinking of the example of Graciela and Jocelyn from the very first week, this is what that teacher is doing, right? She's allowing them to take a look at a website that's in Spanish. So allowing our English learners to kind of support, like get some extra resources so that they can now understand this topic or this material that may be much more demanding for them. So you want to be mindful that the materials are clear and that they're meaningful rather than just being extra work for them, because that's also something we need to be mindful of. Is this really worthwhile in them getting an understanding and supporting that? Or is this now just extra work for them? Because we also don't want them to feel overwhelmed. The fifth feature then is the adaptation of content. So this is how we find ways to make the text or other resource materials accessible for all students. So native language websites work here, podcasts, newspapers. You could summarize a text just to focus on key points. So if in the textbook, the language is really demanding for your English learner, then you could offer them like an outline that just focuses on the key points that they need to walk away with. You could elaborate on the text and add information to maybe include definitions or some background information so that they then have a more complete picture. And then also there are some, I know students on their own are using more Google Translate because that's helpful. But sometimes translating large pieces of text is also very overwhelming. And that's why I kind of like summarizing on my own and providing them this own text that I've created, or creating some sort of outline that's worked really well in the past. The sixth feature then is the activities, those meaningful activities we're doing in class. So we want to make sure that they're planned to promote language development in all skills. So that means oral and written language development that's relevant and necessary for the language objectives and the content objectives. We also want to make sure that the activities generate language practice, and that they're not just the language objectives. So the objectives require explicit instruction. And so the language practice that we're doing shouldn't be the language objective. And so for that reason, authentic, meaningful experiences are important for English learners. So attaching labels and terms to things that are already familiar to them, that would be helpful and meaningful in their language development.